right, thanks for coming after lunch. Hopefully you got some coffee, you're ready to go. I'm Chris King, not Chris Merkel, so the one thing you'll notice here is there are two people on the presentation. My esteemed colleague, Chris Merkel, unfortunately got ill right before this came, but I will try to represent his presence on stage as well. It's just, I guess, brief background. I'm Senior Director for Cyber Threat Operations at Northwestern Mutual, which is a large insurance company in the US. In prior lives, I worked security operations and other leadership roles at Rockwell Automation and as well as CERT. So who here has MFA at the organization? Is willing to, okay, cool. This is good, good numbers. You guys did it. I can walk away, the talk's over. So we started from, you have MFA-enabled, you've gotten away from maybe weak SMS, push-approve methods. So you're good, right? Everything's fine? Well, there's a little bit of a story to tell here. So Microsoft says actually, like doing that basic step, you stop 99.9% of attacks basically that occur. So in their research, enabling MFA is the first step, but there's more. Some bad news. So this chart here shows statistics from Expel, which is a MSSP out of the US, and just in the quarter one, account compromise again, very largely present. So a lot of orgs have MFA. I think I heard like 28% now have MFA, but we're still seeing a 60% plus account compromise. Interesting. Microsoft reports from February to May 2022, doubling of token replay attacks per month from Azure AD records. So that's another kind of interesting statistic. Why are we seeing a doubling of token replay attacks? Again, if we all have MFA, everything should be fine, right? And now articles are starting to come out last year talking about new attacks coming out with MFA bypassing, I'm using my quotes here, bypassing large-scale phishing campaigns that are able to get past MFA. So what does that mean? So we talked about authentication proxy attacks, the title of this talk. You might have heard adversary in the middle. That's kind of another way of describing this. But it's basically a new or recent type of attack that's started to become more popular due to the presence of large-scale weaponized criminal kits that allow for this, like EvilProxy. And they allow the adversary basically to sit in the middle, in between your identity provider and the user. So just to kind of walk through kind of what we're talking about from an authentication perspective. So NCSCNL has a fantastic authentication maturity model. So it's free on their website, highly recommend it. Not very long, but it describes basically from level 0 to level 3, the activities you should take as an organization to help improve your authentication and your overall resilience to these type of attacks. In the US, CISA also has this idea of what they call phishing-resistant MFA, which is kind of a similar theme here. So let's just walk through this real quick so we can in the same page for where we're going to focus from a talk perspective on these specific attacks. So again, back to that Microsoft stat, 99.9% of compromises had no MFA. So these are the kind of password sprays, traditional phishing, breach, replay attacks. These are the things that occur. You don't have MFA, your account gets owned. So that's level 0. Once you enable MFA, you're at level 1. But let's say you have SMS. It's still 40% less effective in testing. Again, this comes from a Microsoft sponsor, but a paper that describes basically that you basically reduce your effectiveness of the overall MFA utility by having SMS due to SIM swapping attacks and other attacks like that. So let's go further. So level 2, level 3, we're talking about you don't have SMS. You're using basically Authenticator. Maybe you're using you're not doing push. You're doing number matching or something like that. So you're really trying to build a lot more resilience into the way that your users access your applications. So we're going to focus on that level 2 and level 3, which NCSCNL says these are where you want to focus your high priority accounts, your low priority accounts, and push towards making sure all those accounts have that phishing resistant MFA enabled. So just kind of step through what this looks like in reality. So this is not new. So 2018, Evilnginx came out. That was kind of the first proxy that could do this. You could do this by hand before, but EvilProxy in the last year or two has really grown in its popularity as a weaponization kit. So the design is pretty simple. Basically, you'll see that the user is going to be phished or some other type of way of getting credentials or getting a link sent to them. They're going to open it up. They're going to enter their creds into basically what the attacker is presenting as their MFA window. The attacker proxy, which sits in between there, is then going to take that, forward it on to the identity provider. Now again, to the user, transparent, it's their identity provider. They feel comfortable with this. The attacker is just simply taking it, copying it, and passing it along. So you see they steal the credentials. They get the session token back from the identity provider. The attacker steals the session token, because again, they're in the middle of this whole conversation here. And then they forward it back to the victim. At that point, the victim now is basically redirected to their own website that they wanted to maybe go to in the first place, whether that's O365 or something similar. And at the same time, the attacker has access to the same level of access that user had access to. But what's worse is due to the type of token that's stolen, which is the primary refresh token, oftentimes that lasts for hours, days, or a week or more, depending on your settings that you have enabled. So now we kind of established what these kind of MFA proxy services do. What are we seeing in the wild? What are we coming across? Now this is a mix of our own research and what we've seen kind of in the trenches. So I'll describe both and give you kind of personal anecdotes as we go through it. Initial access. So starting with, again, it's a chain of attacks here. So the proxy is just how they get access via taking the credentials and the token. They have to somehow get the users to click or go to those sites. The first thing we've observed is lookalike domains. So in this case, I'm showing an example of a law firm, which is a common target. So they'll compromise a law firm, and then they'll send basically a secondary link with a lookalike domain. So in this case, anylawfirm.org versus .com. The user receives the email. It seems like a trusted partner, someone they've worked with. And then they click on it, takes them to the page, and basically they're then presented with that MFA adversary in the middle attack at that point. The second method we've observed, and this is actually a new technique. I haven't seen a lot of people talk about this. There's maybe one blog post in the last couple of weeks about it, but we call it encrypted message hollowing. So it's super interesting. What we've observed is basically attackers look for organizations that have Microsoft E3 licensing, which gives you the ability to encrypt a message. You click a button that says encrypt, encrypts the message, and what they do is they either will hollow out an existing message that as part of a BEC campaign or somewhat, or they have access to a user account that can then encrypt. They send it to people, and the hard part from a defender's perspective is that this is an encrypted message from a user to another user, and in between it's encrypted all the way through. So your inspection tools, email, can't see it. And what's worse is to the user itself. So from an incident response perspective, when that gets opened up, only that user can see it, and only for a certain period of time, based off of what the settings are for that particular encryption client. And we've seen this at least since August 2022. It's been going on for months. We think it's one adversary in particular, very pernicious, very hard. We only got lucky a couple times when a user reported it to actually see the body of the email. If you don't have Microsoft encryption, it sends a link to you to open up that then goes to Microsoft's website, allow you to see the link or see the page there. So again, another way to bypass a lot of those controls you have inspecting email going back and forth. So what does that look like? So after we kind of get the initial access, a link sent, what's the victim experience? So this is just kind of two examples. Very good. So it's hard. A lot of users get tricked from this. It looks completely legitimate. It's sending them, again, that proxy in between you and your IDP. So it either will have the same branding because it's just copying it on the fly, or it's using the Microsoft branding in the back end. So I kind of talked about the attacks, some of the problems, some of the things that we're facing there. But I really want to focus on how do we detect this. So I'm going to give some observations on how we detected it, some ways in which we're trying to combat this, give some tips, and then we'll kind of go into hunting. So first, impossible travel. So impossible travel has been kind of used for a long time. It works pretty well initially, but we saw some change in behavior and tactics that made this a little bit more difficult. So I'll kind of give some alternative approaches to pair with impossible travel. So first is consumer VPN. So unless you have some sort of service that can tell you what's a consumer VPN or not, you're often getting a lot of kind of misleading traffic that will tell you like, oh, this is, looks like it's coming from far away, but it's actually just a VPN service your users will use. The second issue is that we've seen the rise of geolocal proxy access. It's often sold in dark markets, but basically, we're in Montreal, you might see access from Quebec City. So it knows, based off of the target, to basically build a proxy and then deliver it from that location. So from a login perspective, it's a lot harder to track this within your SIM because you're seeing kind of that pairing between the locations as being very similar. What's worked for us, and it's not perfect, is basically matching authenticator changes. So one of the first things that the adversaries do is after they get access to a particular account, is they want to go in and they want to change the backup MFA access. So they want to make sure they can maintain access to the organization. So they'll go into the Authenticator portal and MFA portal and basically say, oh, if you have Authenticator as your primary, I'm going to go and do the backup and make sure that SMS goes to my phone number, or vice versa. And the other thing that's been kind of pernicious has been the new device registration attempts. So basically, again, we're seeing adversaries maliciously register a computer into your environment because they have credentials, they have MFA, they have access, and then they use that initial registration to get all of the tooling they need to bypass a lot of those VPN. The words escape me right now, but basically the integrity checks that happen on the host. So another thing to look for is new device registration because that does occur. All right, going into investigation, hunting, and response. So for the incident responders out there, this shouldn't look too difficult from what you do on a day-to-day basis. Make sure you have your M365 logs. That's super important. OneDrive logs, mail forwarding rules. So again, after they get the initial access, they're changing mail forwarding rules. Authenticator changes, as I mentioned before. User creation, obviously, if they get access to a privileged account. And then exchange mail transport rules. Sorry, and lastly, device enrollment. So not really that different than most kind of attacks. Just make sure you have those logs in your SIM so that you can then do the investigation if it occurs. All right, some threat hunting. Just going to jump right into it. So the first thing to look at, and this is a little complicated, is knowing where your authentication endpoints are. So this took us a while when we first started exploring it, just because it's not super intuitive. And then the second piece is these Microsoft conditional access policies. So Microsoft provides kind of a layer of ways to access your environment and your applications, and they give you kind of different ways to protect that. So you can protect it from a trusted device that goes to a certain endpoint, or it can be an untrusted device, only allows to certain other endpoints. The problem is after a while you get a lot of cap policies, and you have to really ideally break them all out into a matrix and say where do I allow a single factor, because that's one weakness, or where do I allow some sort of other area that I'm not watching? Do I pair up everything there, and have I tested all those different ways to access my environment from different devices, mobile, whatever, to make sure that I'm not missing an endpoint? And there is only one tool I'm aware of that's called CA Optics that basically allows for you to get access to that and do that analysis kind of on the fly without having to manually go through it. Other things to do. So you can hunt for attempts to target your organization. So this has been pretty useful for us to basically look for typo squatting. In some cases, we've seen sso-yourorgname.com or the vice versa. So oftentimes, like if you see a -sso, and ideally that's not your domain or whatever, look for that. That might be a trigger point that someone is targeting you. Looking inside your firewall logs for particular page titles and URI paths related to authentication. They're hidden behind refers. So another kind of pattern we've observed is refer chaining. So even after you get the initial access, you click, it goes through 3 or 4 refers. But look up for that refer chain to see if you start seeing a significant number of refers coming from a particular like email launch or something like that. And lastly, passive DNS is your friend. So when you get the chance to investigate them, look in passive DNS. Oftentimes you'll get some gold and nuggets there. So in our cases, we did observe one threat actor targeting a number of different other organizations just by looking at the passive DNS that happened during the attack. And again, it's very fast. They're torn down within a day or so, but try and do it if you can, if you get access fast enough. Another good technique is hunting externally. So if you have Shodan access, using the unique strings within your logon page DOM is very helpful, and Shodan provides a lot of different ways to do that. But specifically taking like information that's custom to your organization and then hunting for that in Shodan in particular is a pretty good indicator, because oftentimes, again, the attacker is taking a page or copying it, and they want to then pass it back to the user. So where that's interesting to me is, am I seeing, for example, our logo being used on a page that's not actually, our environment, for example. TLS certificates too, that's another good one to look for. Another area we've been pretty effective with is targeting the tool. So in this case, we got lucky. We got quick enough to find an EvilProxy attack that happened, on the fly, and we were able to then find the YARM hash while the site was still up, pivoted on the YARM hash in Shodan, and we found a number of other websites, exact same YARM hash, that did not look legitimate. So that was up for a couple months before they tore it down. But our belief is basically like they within EvilProxy, you set a couple settings. They have some sort of default server settings in particular, and they just launched the proxy service and basically allowed them to maintain it very quickly, but it also, unfortunately for them, they didn't anonymize it enough, so across it, it didn't actually anonymize the totality of the site itself. Tradecraft evolution. I use an AI image here just because it's kind of cool, but basically, adversaries are getting better about OSINT using less infrastructure reuse. So, again, that was a picture of a YARM hash that lived for 4 months before basically it got torn down. The second thing is anti-inspection techniques. So if you use a sandboxing service or something to check those, make sure that you're looking to see for interesting, non-malicious indicators. So being redirected to brave.com, that's kind of benign, but at the same time, there's some attacker behavior where they're redirecting you to a benign site on purpose, basically hide the fact that that you're able to, to basically hide the fact that they are malicious. So in EvilProxy in particular, you can check settings to say, look for sandboxing, add refers, and then redirect to brave.com, for example, in that case. So they're looking for refers and other things like that. Encrypted email, that's another technique, as I mentioned in the beginning, that seems to be much more popular, at least. We've had continued campaigns, again, for 6 months or more, and others in the financial services industry have received them as well. So this is a really hard one to look for, but again, going back to those techniques of looking for those encrypted emails, if your users are reporting, hey, I got an encrypted email from a third party, try and take a look, try and see if you can get access to it fast enough. It might be one of those types of attacks that we just mentioned. And I can share more details offline on how to look for the encrypted mail attacks in particular. And then probably the worst one is SMS-based phishing. So a lot of your users' information is located on these like data broker sites that are often being purchased by threat actors when they target people. The SMS-based attacks are effective and also difficult to monitor. So if you're not monitoring your mobile phones, which most people don't, at least most organizations don't, user gets an SMS message, they think it's from their boss or something, or it looks like a 2FA, they click the link, looks like a Microsoft page, and they enter creds in. You have no way of knowing the user did that unless they tell you. So just to kind of summarize some of the points I made and where to go next. So start with identifying indicators of activity relevant to your organization. So look at your logon pages, use that, weaponize that against the adversary. Make sure you're using phishing-resistant MFA. Authenticator is very effective, but don't do push, for example. Follow the CERT guidance, follow the NCSE NL guidance. Look for unique authentication signatures in unexpected places. Shodan Hunt has been very effective, so try that out when you see these attacks occur. And then look for unexpected account management events. So those authenticator registrations, those device registrations. They don't happen that much, depending on the size of your organization. You should be able to look for that being done maliciously by pairing it with those external data points that I mentioned. And lastly, if you're not simulating an attack, please do. It's effective. It allows you to prove that your detections are working, and allows you to prove whether or not you have the actual vulnerability in question. Any questions to start?
Really nice presentation, thank you. It's also
Thanks.
something that we've experienced, so interesting. So a number of the threat hunting, I'm wondering if you were able to actually flip into more standardized detection content so that it's not like a manual process for a threat hunter, rather you've been able to instrument it somehow. So wondering if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, so I think you're asking specifically if I'm able to use, or we are able to use, Shodan, some sort of automation framework, basically, right? Like, or some, yeah. Good question. Oh, that's on our roadmap. We haven't done that yet. It's been more ad hoc searching for that right now. But that would be kind of the next evolution, is to be able to do that in an automated fashion. That tool and others provide good APIs to do that. So yeah, good point.
Anyone else? Chris finished early, so we have plenty of time. Oh, yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Could you elaborate a bit on phishing-resistant MFA? Are you just talking about time-based OTP tokens, or?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last part. Can you just repeat that?
Can you elaborate a bit on phishing-resistant MFAs?
Oh, yeah,
the
sure.
methods, please.
Yeah. So I think the idea behind phishing-resistant MFA is using, so these techniques in particular exploit certain parts of the user experience. So with SMS, for example, it can be delivered in a way that can be intercepted by the adversary. The push attacks with basically push fatigue that occurs. So that causes the user to get a million notifications. They just press and accept and move on. So some of the phishing resistant idea behind it is that they're just supposed to be more difficult for the adversary to trick from those push methods. At least that's my understanding of it. So things like number matching, where you have to look on your phone and then match that to what's on the screen, or you enter the numbers manually. Those are better. And FIDO tokens are kind of like the next step. So moving to something where you have a hardware key or some sort of hardware service is the ideal state. They're much more difficult to bypass, much harder. Software tokens are a little bit easier. You can still do some of those token replay attacks, but with the hardware tokens, you're essentially running a much greater layer of security. I do know some organizations that have just gone full hardware token. A little difficult, at least for us, to implement, but I know there's some browser movement towards, I think it's Authn, that's trying to really allow for your browser itself to kind of do that same phishing resistant MFA. Did I answer the question? Okay.
Anyone else? Please.
In terms of the SMS phishing that's actually on the rise at the moment, beside the user awareness, any recommendation on how we can protect the users from SMS phishing?
Yeah, I guess I'm hoping for ideas. Yeah, user awareness has been good. I mean, that's honestly the best intel in some cases, is just the user saying, hey, I got phished and this is what it was. Okay, like now I actually have an idea what happened. But yeah, I don't have a good idea.
We have lots of time. I'll take a moment to point out, I've been coming to this conference off and on since '91. If you have any questions from somebody who's been there, feel free to pin me down later during the coffee break or whatever. And then, Chris, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Can you explain your Mastodon and Twitter handles, please?
Sorry, you want me to explain my Twitter and Mastodon account?
Yeah, your handles.
Oh, yeah, sure. It's actually, I think it's from a book, a fantasy book a long time ago. There was a city named Armengar that had giant walls 100 feet high. So I just thought it was a neat term.
It was like a book where they like print stuff on paper.
Yeah, it was an old school book on paper. Yeah.
Thank you. Reminder, folks, please remember to fill out the survey forms. Let's give Chris another hand. Thank you for the vote.
Yeah. Thank you.